Welcome back to the entertainment room, and I am so excited to put out my first ranking video. This may feel like a random start, but with streaming availability and my work schedule, I kinda had to pick a series that I had easy access to during the day. And thankfully things have been a little slow lately, so I've been able to complete the Paranormal Activity series, all 7 films. And thankfully, that wasn't an excruciating experience ultimately. Before this binge, I had seen all of them at least one time, except for the newest film, Next of Kin. This franchise has been an odd one for me. For a found footage fan, I'd always been excited to watch each sequel as these films came out, but I was always kind of losing faith in the series at the same time. After seeing through the series again, I only really dislike maybe 2 of the installments, but while I enjoyed the others, they are flawed for sure, as many found footage films are. So I didn't give a top-notch score really to any of the good ones, or the ones I thought were good, but I would revisit this series in the future, as I did have a really fun time doing this. I will go through each film in some detail and discuss what I do and don't like, and also rank them. This may be self-explanatory, but of course, spoiler alert, so I will get into specific plot points. Last thing before I start, I can understand if people despise these films. I can see how these films may feel cheap to some, or may just not land as well, or scare as well as some other films. But I do personally think that several installments of the series work as a whole. What kept me going with many of them, even when the scares were lacking, was the story and how everything was connecting as each film went on. Though if you're not really into the story as much, and you're just there for just basic scares, then of course that may hinder your enjoyment of some of the films, and that could be a problem. Most of the time though, the pacing was decent with the scares, as far as I was concerned, but several also take their time with the mystery behind what is haunting each of these families. But I'll try my best to explain as I go, but remember, above all else, I just want to have fun with this. This is my opinion. I'm not expecting to change anyone's mind, because I'm sure just about everybody probably has a different ranking. I just love watching and listening to ranking videos, whether I completely agree with them or not. So I do hope you all enjoy this process and just hearing an honest review about each installment to the franchise. So I'm ranking worst to best. Let's get started. So the worst, or the number 7 spot on my list, goes to Paranormal Activity, Next of Kin. And I swear, I'm not trying to beat up on it because it's the most recent in the franchise. I went into this ready to like it more than the number 6 spot, despite off the bat reading that there is no real connection to the previous films. I figured it wasn't fair to be disappointed for it going in a new direction, so I went into it with an open mind. But ultimately, this just feels so uninspired overall. And the name Paranormal Activity in the title, it really just feels like it was slapped on there to reel people in more easily. A frustrating marketing tactic, to be honest. This film was directed by William Eubank, and this is his only involvement in directing one of these films. And don't get me wrong, he's done some impressive work, especially with the 2014 film The Signal and 2020's Underwater, which wasn't the best storyline, but the effects were fantastic, and I thought the direction was great. Christopher Landon was the writer here, and he has done a great job with his writing overall in the franchise. He's done most of these films, I would say. Oren Peli was the writer and director of the first movie, and the series wasn't in large a big part of his idea, so he was writing credit in all the other sequels as well, including this one. This is also the first film in the series to not get a theatrical release, and that, at this point, was due to COVID. Jason Blum, one of the predominant producers of the franchise, does not like this film at all, and has apparently stated that he will not be involved if there are any future installments. While it does feel like the end of an era, if the series is truly done, I'm not sure what else they could really do that would go over well and that would be unique. especially with a plethora of other found footage films out there. Plus, I'm not completely confident they would do a great job dealing with the main demon, who they always call Toby in the other films, in his continuation after his come up from the ghost dimension. But I'll get into that a little more later. My possible connection with the other films, and I use that word very loosely, is the possible involvement of the demon Asmodeus, who is theorized to be the actual name of the demon from the other films, who was called Toby. This is thought to be the case when Mika in the first film had a demonology book with the literature on this demon, but I don't believe this is confirmed. But outside of that, there's no other connection to speak of, it seems. But next of kin follows Margot, as she is shooting a documentary about what may have happened to her mom. Her mom left her at the hospital when she was a baby. She has video footage of this, security cam footage. And she wants to visit the Amish community she is from and investigate why she did what she did. With the help of Samuel, a biological relative of hers of the community, Chris, her cameraman, and Dale, her sound guy, they head off to the community to discover the truth. This is a passable plot setup, but setting aside the fact that nothing relates to other films, I was just never really invested in the story, even as it progressed. The core characters are admirable enough, and seem like okay people. Dale kind of worked out nicely as a character, mostly as comic relief at times. He often said incredibly strange things, just these random outbursts of random facts or random thoughts he had, and just Margot's looks over to Chris, the cameraman, were just funny. Such as little moments like that were kind of cool to me. I do generally love cult movies and conspiracy plots, but here it just felt really mundane, to say the least. Scares are minimal for a while, which is similar to other films, and it has worked out in the past. But like I said, the story isn't drawing me in. I'm going to be a little bit bored. Even for some of the other weaker installments, you kind of get the same scare tropes here, and they just felt even more tired than a lot of the other installments. And one of the main tropes, especially in one scene, includes the cameraman. He has the camera, he hears a voice behind him, he turns around, he pauses, he turns back, and of course something is there to try and scare the audience. And that's whether it's a genuine threat or just another person or family member who found them. Chris, for instance, in the scene where he is outside trying to fix the generator, he gets jump scared like this not once but twice in a row, and it was just handled so awfully. One thing I do look back on fondly, though, was the bedroom scene where Margot can't wake up either Dale or Chris, and then she becomes possessed, incapacitated, whatever, for a little bit. It was nothing super original, but just the different shots were just handled really well. It was just a very creepy scene. It kind of stood out from the rest of the movie. The attic scene with Margot was okay, also. Finding her mom's letters, hiding under the bed, and having an unseen force putting pressure on it as if somebody was sitting down. The church was also really creepy. Probably the best setting in the film, especially with its hidden tunnel. I do wish they had done a little more with the tunnel in the church. But towards the end, her mother Sarah, the golem-looking creature that chased after her, was actually pretty frightening. And the look of this Sarah character and the twist, that's one of the few things I feel like I can praise about the film. The movements, seeing her crawl out of the tunnel after being freed. There are several cheesy moments, though. This film also switches from found footage to just like regular shots, I guess. That maybe can work in some projects, but just not here for me. It just felt random most of the time and actually kind of took me out of the feel and the tone of the story a bit. Another issue I had, there's this okay scene where Chris randomly shows the kids in the village how to do slow motion on the camera, and this becomes randomly relevant later with Dale's death. His death was being sliced at by Sarah in the chest and abdomen, and for some reason they put it in slow motion, and it was just such an odd stylistic choice and just so random. Other films felt more natural and real with their very basic effects, the other Paranormal Activity films, at least most of them. This stylistic choice, though, just kind of deteriorated the intensity a bit. Another thing that kind of worked, there were interviews with the villagers. Conversations that were completely shut down by the women and the children as they asked more and more questions, and it was just ominous. They just kind of went from talking to them like normal to just completely brushing them off. I thought that was still a nice, creepy little touch. They also included a score, like a musical score, throughout the film, especially in these suspenseful moments, which for me is a huge don't when it comes to found footage films. There really should not be a score until maybe the end credits, but as far as the actual footage, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of found footage in that feel. I like when characters in found footage in particular are searching a setting or searching their surroundings. You only get the natural noises and the sounds of the setting or presence that is hunting them. The jump scares that tend to follow are much more effective after that. The ending was okay, I guess. The graphic chaos that ensued when the demon escaped and was rapidly possessing everyone and making anyone and everyone kill each other, basically. The police cruiser camera showing the demon in Samuel's body, who is easily forcing the officers to turn their guns on themselves and then driving off to wreak havoc on the rest of the world, was a nice little ending, nice little final shot. But overall, though, with a lacking story and unconvincing scares, the finale just feels unearned, ultimately. Now, I was more excited just to be done watching. I found myself checking the time a lot. And again, it's a cool idea, dealing with, making sacrifices to keep away the powerful entities that could wreak havoc on the world. That trope is still a really cool idea to me. I loved it in Cabin in the Woods. I just don't feel like I'll come back to this one because I didn't feel like anything was done super well. It just feels very forgettable. So I'm going to give Next of Kin a 4.8 out of 10. This is also the longest installment, and for the first time probably, I felt the longer length in a very bad way. The number 6 spot is the only other installment I would say I didn't particularly care for. A couple others surprised me on rewatch. This one just felt worse than a lot of the others. A couple others surprised me on rewatch, but this one just felt like the worst in the original storyline. But at number 6, I have Paranormal Activity, The Ghost Dimension. And again, I'm not bullying it because it is the later installment, or a later installment. I like certain aspects, particularly the continuation, and I guess the finale of the original storyline. This is likely why I think I put it not in last place. In this film, they find a ghost camera and their belongings. At first, this seemed like an okay addition, something a little different for them to play with, but it got more annoying with the piss poor special effects as the film went on. Gregory Plotkin is the director this time. I believe this is also his only involvement with the franchise, as far as I could tell. He's usually an editor as his career, but he did direct Hellfest in 2018. And although I haven't heard glowing things about that, he has played a part as an editor in some pretty nice films, such as Get Out, Happy Death Day, and Game Night. There are also way too many fucking writers here. 5 writers, actually. Also new to the franchise, I believe, at least as far as writing credits go. Now that doesn't mean they couldn't have breathed new life into the series, but that is a lot of hands in the basket. This also felt like the most gimmicky entry, aside from arguably Next of Kin. This film was released in theaters with a 3D option, and I haven't seen that version, but I can already tell that was a stupid idea. This is one of the most expensive entries in the franchise as well, and for no good reason. Such wasted money. The effects of the demons, particularly the Toby, or maybe the Asmodeus character, the weird white particles and shapes the ghost camera picks up, it's all just almost hilarious. Just the effects ruined this film in so many ways. Paranormal Activity films once thrived off the idea that less is more, especially with the effects. And any scares in this film, or suspense that is built from the original tactic, looking around the dark house, seeing an outline of a person you don't know, those aspects of the film still worked in a lot of scenes. Not as well, but it was still better than seeing Toby in his form. And also the new Toby form he was getting just looked awful, and it's just way overutilized, just the black figure. And I get it. You know, he's finding his physical form and he's being integrated into our world officially. Got it. I just wish they had done something a little different with this, or at least showed his shape less. Like, a lot less. For the scares, there are a handful of decent ones, but the formula and the setup is the same, but it's done nearly 5 to 10 times worse, in my opinion. The finale was decent, I think. The dread from Toby becoming his own being in our world was unsettling, and a sequel exploring this could work, but I'm not sure I trust many people to try it, so the series may need to really die here. The doorway over Layla's bed is a little odd looking maybe, but I was into its design as a whole. I thought it was one of the better looking shots in the film. Many may oppose this next thing I'm about to say, but I have enjoyed a lot of the families that have been written, personality wise. The closeness and the quirks, the conversations they have. I tend to feel for them, even if some stupid decisions or mistakes are made. Family was no real exception to this, but for some reason I just wasn't quite as invested in them. It's possible the other complaints I just had kind of drained me and pulled me out of the story and out of the whole feel of the film. Layla, the young daughter in the film who Toby targets this time around, delivers a consistent performance. Out actors as a whole in this series, to be honest, were surprisingly impressive, I would say. Their conversations with Toby and the vague details that they share with the parents is very creepy, but maybe starts to feel a little overdone, but it still worked for me here. One string of scenes I enjoyed was Mike and Ryan watching the tapes of the coven that they found. You know, they had Katie or Christy at various points closing their eyes and telling the other members of the cult what they see. And it was really unsettling that they started describing the room Mike and Ryan are in, as well as saying that she sees brothers. But the story again kept me invested for the most part when nothing else did, especially the connection that was built between Layla and Hunter from Paranormal Activity 2. The attempted extermination scene with the priest had its pros, despite the cheap-ass CGI demon face at the end. These effects became more and more irritating as I realized they were likely only really there to appeal to the 3D idea, which is just a huge distraction. This installment does highlight that less is more, because the film is just doing way too much at the end of the day. I guess I'll give Ghost Dimension maybe a 5 out of 10. Still had its moments, and it's still better to me than Next of Kin, somehow. But I was just more invested in the characters and the story in this one. And, you know, it had some effectively disturbing moments. You know, a couple. And at my number 5 spot, I have to go with Paranormal Activity 4. When I was preparing to restart this series, I fully expected to place this film in the number 7 spot, or at best the number 6, because I remember liking close to nothing about this sequel originally. But on this watch, it's still not great, but it had much more to offer than I remembered. Harry Joost and Rael Schulman return as directors after Paranormal Activity 3. They've worked together on several other projects, including Catfish, Nerve, and Project Power, and also Christopher Landon is once again the writer alongside Chris Feehan. My primary issue here with this film is the lack of story, or at least compared to what I would expect out of the first real sequel to the first installment, timeline-wise. The choice with Robbie and Wyatt, with Wyatt actually being Hunter from Paranormal Activity 2, instead of the mysterious and creepy Robbie, was actually kind of cool as a whole, if not a little predictable. There's enough content to hold my interest a decent amount of the time, but it just felt like they did less than the previous 3 films. The family this film focuses on this time is also just kind of okay. This is the first entry, really, where the parents have significant strain in their relationship from the start. That's a fine change-up from the previous films, but the way it was done, I just ended up kind of feeling less for the parents and the family as a unit. They really put them on the screen for that long this time, and they really didn't give me enough to make me care about the parents as much. All I really learned is that they simply just don't get along, and the husband works a lot. I didn't even care to learn their names this time until after the movie had already ended. They're also the most grating parents when it comes to just waiting forever to at least just entertain the idea of something being really wrong with the house or with Robbie or whatever the case. If I had kids and they were constantly nagging me daily about strange stuff going on, I just feel like I would come around to at least trying to listen to them, to at least entertain it, even if it is just some kind of joke that they were desperate to tell me. I know the paranormal aspect is obviously going to be hard to believe for most people, but if the kids aren't letting it go and they're still concerned for this long, especially the older teen child and not just the younger one, I would have at least reviewed the camera footage that they kept trying to show me, at the very least. Oh, and their names, by the way, are Doug and Holly. But on a serious note, though, I do want to say rest in peace to Steve Dunham, who played Doug. Apparently he had a heart attack before the film had its theatrical release. And him and Alexandra Lee, who played Holly, or the mom in the film, were actually married in real life for a while. So I do want to pay my respects there. I'm not trying to be disrespectful by critiquing their characters too much. Just still giving an honest review. But on the bright side, I really had no issues with the acting still from anybody in this film. It's just how a lot of these characters were written this time around. I do hope that Miss Lee also is doing alright these days. But on with the review though, Alex is the name of our lead, the older daughter. She's played by Katherine Newton, and she's done some pretty awesome work in the past, some interesting characters. Her main one these days being Cassie Lang in the Ant-Man films. And also she was the lead alongside Vince Vaughn in the horror comedy Freaky, which is a film I really enjoy, especially around this time of year. Besides her, Wyatt, and Robbie, the other main character we see is her boyfriend Ben, who kind of sort of grew on me as the film went. Originally, we just heard about how horny he was about his characterization. Each Paranormal Activity film tackled a different way to shoot some of the scenes, found footage style, to create scares in a different way. Ghost Dimension had the ghost camera, which, not a great example, but that's just what we have so far on this list. Here, a laptop camera is often used when Alex and Ben are talking late at night. And this method has been utilized before this film, and utilized well, but here, it just didn't really work out so much. They really did close to nothing with it, or at least nothing interesting. If you've seen the VHS horror films, particularly the first one, I love the short film with the laptop camera there. That was a good example of utilizing that in a really cool way. Also, other found footage films. There's one called The Den that was done really well. That's really underrated found footage installment. And the thrillers Searching and Missing seem to do really well with that also. I have not seen Missing yet, but Searching was a really cool installment. Here they really could have done much more and just had much more fun with the idea. Another note, the neighbor, Robbie, was more of the creepy child figure in this installment, much more so than Wyatt. And again, these child stars do pretty well, as far as I'm concerned. I wish they had gone a little more into Robbie's backstory more, since it was revealed that he is not Hunter from Paranormal Activity 2. I know he's not the main focus on the story, but still, like, who is he? Why is he with the possessed Katie now? I heard some trivia that maybe he's named after Robbie Mannheim, who in 1959 was an alleged victim of possession and was saved by exorcism, an event that I believe inspired the Exorcist novel. So there's that possibility, I guess. I just wish I had gotten a little bit more. On another bright side, though, I still get nervous seeing Katie make appearances, knowing what she is now. And it was actually surprising when I did see her again in this film. She's effectively creepy, like without even really trying anymore. The death scenes with Alex's boyfriend Ben and her mom Holly are some of the most unnerving moments in this film, mostly due to Katie's involvement on screen. Katie standing directly behind a character before just snapping their neck are staple moments in my memory with this series. Here with Ben's murder, then also the father's murder in Paranormal Activity 2. Both of those just stand out, just how they were done. Another little thing I noticed this time that I didn't really notice on previous viewings of this film was the little white figure playing with the boys and moving around when the Xbox Connect lights were on in the middle of the night. So that was kind of a cool addition. The first half of this film still builds pretty slowly overall, and again, that has worked in other films for me. But suspense is just not really built effectively for a while. Some people would argue it wasn't really built at all. I think part of that has to do with the increase in fake scares, where characters just keep pranking each other. I feel like they overutilize that, especially in this installment. That did work for me though, even on my initial viewing years ago. The main scene that still stood out to me until recently was when Holly was cooking dinner one night, and the knife she was using just shot up to the ceiling on its own. There's a good bit of tension and uneasiness, and me wondering when it would come back down. Holly's just confused by this and ultimately grabs another knife. But then she continues using it on the same cutting board in the same spot where the knife just left from. So that kind of kept me on edge a bit. And then with Doug later that night, when he goes into the kitchen where his computer turns on randomly, he turns it off, and there's a couple decent jump scares back to back. The first one being when you see the black figure suddenly rush past in front of the Xbox camera. And then, when he's already on edge about that, the knife finally slams back onto the counter, onto the cutting board. That was just a cool little transition. It's just a simple tactic that just worked better than most other attempts at scares in this film. The last few minutes with Alex in the house was also really well done. I'm surprised I didn't remember the ending to this film. With Katie charging at her down the hall with a really loud and booming demonic scream. Then her coming face to face with the numerous members of the coven with the black eyes out in the backyard. While these few scenes are fair and are handled with a decent amount of care, it seems, this film was still kind of a letdown. I think especially at the time, I think it let a lot of people down. But I still feel like it had more moments that stood out to me, moments I would return to, more so than this number 6 and number 7 spots on my list. And this film I actually would watch again if I were to rewatch the series. It's just possible I would stop after marked ones maybe. And maybe I'll watch Ghost Dimension just to finish out the original story. But this film was okay. I'll give it a 5.8 out of 10. Again, the scares that worked really, really well. There's just less of them. But after this one, now that I'm done with the 4th installment to the series, we'll get into films that I for sure enjoyed as a whole and would revisit. And for my number 4 spot, I was kind of torn between this one in particular and my ultimate number 3 spot. I really was unsure and still am, but I'm confident enough to settle on number 4, going to Paranormal Activity, the marked ones. This was also an entry I enjoyed more on this viewing than my original one. This is only my second time seeing this film. I remember liking the ending, and that was just about it my first time around. For writing and directing this time, Christopher Landon takes on both roles. This film takes place 6 years after the first film. Now, I haven't really mentioned this yet, but this is the 5th film after Paranormal Activity 4, since it's not labeled as Paranormal Activity 5, just in case anybody forgot or hasn't really seen the series as much. I think the 4th film led to the steady decline in popularity in the franchise, as up to this point, this installment had the lowest opening weekend at the box office, which was definitely concerning for the series. The characters in this one grew on me a lot, but I was particularly annoyed with them in the beginning and almost kind of bored in some aspects of these characters' moments and them hanging out. They just seem like basic, reckless teenagers, just the rebellious type. Which kind of makes sense for their age. I just wasn't as invested in how they kind of wrote them in. But as shit gets real, the care and the loyalty that they had for one another really shine through. And I felt more empathy for them, especially for their, of course, unfortunate outcome in the end. It's also nice to have a switch in kind of ethnicity and social class in this film. The first 4 films had white, well-off families as central characters, and of course there's nothing wrong with that. It's just nice to see a different viewpoint, different culture dealing with the hauntings. And Jesse is the lead character alongside Hector and Marisol, and there was chemistry for sure between the 3 of them, but particularly between Hector and Jesse. Their reactions to Jesse's powers in the beginning was odd, I would say. They're young guys, I know, but I was surprised about the lack of fear and panic as to why he had these powers and where they came from. And almost all of their emotions were just excitement, and that was just about it. I like the setting and the design of Anna's house. The creepy woman next door to them, affectionately called Bruja. The valedictorian Oscar had a little menacing scene where he was completely possessed and talking to Jesse after they came face to face. The actor Carlos Pratt, who portrays Oscar, just really does an excellent job with his little monologue, his little conversation with Jesse right before his character's death. And we get some nice foreshadowing into what Jesse will turn into, most likely. Also, something else that was kind of cool, the communication this trio had with the demon using the Simon Electric memory game versus a Ouija board was clever. It's not the creepiest method, I wouldn't say, but it was different. Something other than the Ouija board that I just mentioned. A subplot that briefly comes up is the possibility of the Coven and the demons time jumping. That topic being some brief foreshadowing, especially for the ending as well as the rest of the series. And it's a cool idea that they incorporate that into this. Back at Anna's house, a scare that had me pretty on edge was when Jesse went back alone to Anna's house and went into the basement. After he goes down the secret passage, he abruptly sees Katie and Christy as children with black eyes, and then gets a decent jump scare. And this is right before Jesse becomes possessed completely. A little note, definitely read more about after the fact. This is the second time in the franchise that we see the word Muse, I believe, M-E-U-S. And this time it was written on Jesse's wall after his final possession scene. Just the Latin word for mine. It's also on the basement door in Paranormal Activity 2, which I guess is referring to Hunter, potentially. There's a cool brief cameo with the character Allie Ray from Paranormal Activity 2, the lone survivor, aside from maybe Hunter. She's still played by the now more grown-up Molly Ephraim, who explains to Hector and Marisol some of the different symbols that they've seen of the Coven. In the entire finale of Marisol, Hector, and Arturo, who is Oscar's brother, going to Grandma Lois's house from the end of the Paranormal Activity 3 film, was an exciting tie-in, especially with how great the third film was. Also, the third film had one of my favorite endings of the series. The witches in the Coven are just middle-aged white ladies, but honestly, they are still terrifying whenever I see them in this franchise. Especially in this case, seeing them running at our protagonist fast as fuck with knives. That was just really... I did not remember that scene at all, and that was just kind of awesome, seeing that. Once they're in the house, Marisol doesn't last long, but Hector has quite the adventure before his death. One of my favorite transitions in this film is a sheet that was covering a chair in the house, and all of a sudden it flies at Hector, but as soon as he gets it out of the way, you see Jesse standing in that spot instead, and then just seeing Jesse charge at Hector with a demonic roar, and just all the sound effects, particularly the heavy stomping that's become so classic in this series. It's just one of the most exciting endings to me. Just a lot of really cool ideas incorporated in this house. Then, of course, the big finish with Hector exiting the room that he was in, hiding from Jesse right there at the end. He exits the room, and we get the ending to the first film. It's kind of what we talked about earlier with the time jumping. He sees Katie coming downstairs slowly. He tries to call out to her, but this just leads to her screaming and Mika coming down trying to defend her, only for Katie to in turn kill him. And then we get the final jump scare with Jesse, I'm guessing, killing Hector. We don't see that, but that's what's to be assumed. I just remember being blown away by this connection. And I was watching this film to see if I thought it was stupid or if it didn't work. But I think it still ties in nicely with the story that they're running with as each film progresses, as the story progresses. I still think it's an awesome ending, and the one I'd revisit the most, I would say. I was surprised how much more I liked this film as a whole. Again, in the beginning, isn't my favorite. It builds a little bit more slowly without as much interesting stuff happening, but once it gets started, it really takes off for a while and has some really awesome scenes. The pacing does improve, for sure. It just takes a little while to get there. The acting, though, is still quite good. So overall, this is a flawed effort still, and it still failed to draw audiences back in to the theaters, unfortunately. An installment that improved in a lot of ways, and again, contains one of my favorite endings to the franchise. So I want to give the marked ones a 6.4. Okay, so my top 3 spots were especially tough to rank. Down the road, I may even switch them around just a little bit. But as it stands now, the number 3 spot actually goes to my previous favorite in the franchise, Paranormal Activity 2. Now, I doubt I would ever place this at my number 1. I even considered placing it just below the marked ones for a little bit. But there's a lot of charm in the second installment, and still with an ending I've never forgotten any detail of since my theater experience with it. I can also be a bit biased as I think this was the only Paranormal Activity film I saw in theaters. This was middle school for me, and I was with a decent sized group of friends at this point who were all really invested in this installment, plus a nearly full theater really gave this the full experience. I do remember being on edge during and after the film. This film had a much quicker box office success its opening weekend. I think the first film's popularity was a bit delayed, but it did have massive growth eventually. This one arguably had the most hype around it, I would say. Also don't remember found footage films being quite as tired of a trend yet, even at this point, so seeing the film for the first time still packed a punch for me a lot more than if it was released today. When it comes to my ratings of these films, I do take into account how impactful a film was at the time of its release. The first 2 installments especially were not brand new ideas with the found footage setup, but it definitely helped to popularize the style a bit more. But on the flip side though, for a film to be a great 9 or 10 out of 10 film for me, it really needs to help stand the test of time, no matter what year it came out. I think that's a big thing for me when it comes to highly rated films. And a lot of classic horror films today are still really scary, even with the limited technology and effects. These first 2 films in particular are more simple in their scares and how they set them up, and we do see a lot of similar tactics now. But these scares in these films still work at creeping me out a good bit. So I won't let modern times tarnish my review too much, especially since I still found massive enjoyment rewatching a lot of these films. I think the reason I ranked this a little lower than the first 2 was mostly due to pacing. It's not bad here, it's just not as strong as my first 2 spots. The story and the characterization is admirable here still. My full suspense was missing a bit for a little too long, and some of the encounters and conversations overstayed their welcome. But when everything does amp up, it really amps up with some grit and personality. What also helped was that I did enjoy the family as a whole. Their banter and their chemistry, plus some of the dad jokes coming from the dad, whose name was Daniel. This installment actually isn't a sequel really until the final night. It follows Katie's sister Christy and her family, and it takes place a couple months before the end of the first film. That is until the final night, which is the evening after Mika's death and Katie's possession. Christy and Daniel have their daughter Allie, who again made an appearance in the marked ones, which is really cool. And Hunter is the youngest in the family, who the demon is after in this case. He has a newborn, and then a toddler here. You can't forget their awesome German Shepherd also, named Abby, who is injured, but not killed, so maybe crime is definitely not committed there, at least. The initial nights are mostly uneventful, or with subtle events happening. The first clue to the supernatural fuckery going on is their housekeeper Martine sensing bad spirits and trying to pray over the house. There's still a lot of mystery to Katie and Christy's past. Katie reveals in the first film that her and Christy had a dark past that they can't completely remember, but Katie at least has been aware that something has been attached to her over the years. An incredibly well done jump scare is when Christy is alone in the kitchen one morning and all is quiet, and a completely unexpected jump scare happens, one that stands out among most others to date. It's when cabinets suddenly fly open all at once and all the contents are thrown out as well. Randomness for jump scares can also be quite effective as a tactic. And also the entire sequence with Christy being in a trance or possessed was frightening as a whole. Also, and the scene before the final night in the basement with a night vision on the camera was really well done, even though I know it's not the most original, even for today. But the final night again is one ending scene that I can remember nearly every detail of again. Especially at the time, it was horrifying to see Katie again in her possessed form, with the blood on her white shirt and everything. Her transition to staring at Daniel from across the room in the kitchen while he was watching TV, to all of a sudden being behind him and snapping his neck, was especially unsettling and unexpected at the time, and just how quickly it happened. Then her slow, casual ascent up the stairs to Hunter's room where Christy was holding him. And then Christy's shaky voice as she calls out to Katie before she is killed and Hunter is kidnapped. It's just so much anticipation, and Katie just being so calm and collected and just emotionless with each act. In the last half of this film, the intensity definitely is again amped up. There's supposedly going to be an alternate ending where Katie kills Hunter, but it was scrapped for being a bit too violent for what the series was going for. And continuing the series or not, I do think this is a better, more harrowing ending, with Hunter's whereabouts being unknown. One thing I forgot I wanted to go back to and mention was the scene with Christy and all the cabinets opening at once. They told the actress playing Christy that only one cabinet would fly open, and I would have damn near shit myself. She handled it a lot better than me with her, her hesitation and her confusion she had. That really wasn't acting ultimately. Just knowing how genuine her reaction was just still kind of makes me laugh, but also I've been so angry with everybody who set that up without telling me. Todd Williams was the director here. I didn't mention that before. His only work I recognized was Cell for 2016. The Stephen King novel adaptation. Haven't seen it, also haven't heard very many great things about it, but I'm happy the project turned out better than I'm guessing that did. And there's 3 writers this time. Michael Perry, who worked with Oren Peli actually on their show The River. Christopher Landon again, had his first writing credit for the series here. Last writer is Tom Pabst, who had part in the show Titans. That's all I really know about him. So I'm going to give Paranormal Activity 2 a 6.8 out of 10. At my number 2 spot, I actually have the OG 2007 Paranormal Activity. With its simplicity, I thought I would rate it a bit lower on my list, but with its superior pacing and subtle and effective scares, especially with such a micro budget of around $15,000, it's still quite impressive today, just with all of that. Oren Peli also shot it in his own house at the time, and he had no script for anyone at all, just behaviors, no lines. So imagine how Mika and Katie had their chemistry and had their banter and everything. It was really cool, keeping that in mind. I remember watching this film for the first time in middle school as well. My stepbrother and I had all the lights off in my room, and we had a great time with it. Unfortunately, I did not get to see it in theaters when it was first released. And of course, my stepbrother has some over-the-top reactions to it also, and that kind of added to the experience for me. It's a fond memory I have as a whole, and I remember being pretty scared watching this still. Because again, this was a new concept to me, at least at the time. I'm not even sure that I had seen a found footage film before. I don't even think I saw Blair Witch Project yet, which never really scared me too badly, just with when I first saw it, knowing the story behind it. And also, on the other end of the spectrum, I wasn't quite as adventurous or twisted enough to have seen Cannibal Holocaust or any film like that. This is an experience that would have been nice to have if I had seen it in theaters, but that's still okay. It still packed a punch for me at the time. This film follows Katie and Mika again. They're in a new house, and slightly off things at first begin to happen, and they try and figure out, what's going on. It's revealed early with some exposition when they are talking to a psychic that Katie had an incident she can't fully remember as a child, but she knows something has been following her and announcing its presence off and on throughout her life, and the activity is starting up again. Mika has an obsession with cameras. He buys a new one. He has to record everything they do. This really is the best paced film, I would say, in terms of scares. Not the best scares in the franchise, not at all, but everything flows together pretty well, and they don't waste too much time on little things. The inclusion of a demon instills dread that leaving a house won't save them. That kind of throws that common argument out the window, because whatever is haunting them will follow, because it's Katie that it wants. On the other hand, though, every film, it seems, brushes off the advice of not trying to communicate with the demon or giving it attention by just recording it all the time or using a Ouija board or any other means of communication to ask it questions. So that's something stupid people keep doing. Most of the nights segments are what today are very basic tropes, lights turning off, a shadow moving over the bed, something falling down on the first floor. The string of night segments are not the most impressive by today's standards, or even by the standards of this franchise. But for me, for its time, this is still a filming tactic that wasn't at least widely used at this point. So with our characters, I like Katie and Mika for the most part. Enough to care about their outcome. Although Mika is pretty self-centered for a good chunk of the film, especially with the camera, always having to record it despite Katie's pleas. He doesn't always acknowledge or reassure Katie, as a husband or boyfriend or whatever he is. But my personal big issue with Mika is playing with a fucking Ouija board when he was begged not to, especially with his logic that followed the argument they're about to have, and how seriously he did not take it. He literally says, "I told you I wouldn't buy a Ouija board. I found this one." I would need to leave the house instantly, or I would absolutely slap the shit out of him if he had told me some bullshit like that. But anyways, the third act is still pretty memorable as well, even for today. The sequels have more daytime activity from the demon, but having it in this one at the time was really unexpected, because the daytime was thought to be some breathing room from the previous night's activity, or to build the characters or the story a little bit more. So I thought that was kind of a cool change for the time. Katie getting dragged out of the bed was a nice touch also, and hearing the booming footsteps for the first time that you hear in the series, especially the one time for the door slam shut. But for the films that had the night segments, I was always excited to see what would happen next. Katie finding her burnt childhood photo that shouldn't have survived the fire she supposedly had was kind of a creepy touch, especially seeing that photo in pristine condition in Paranormal Activity 2 in Chrissy's house. Another moment I liked, I don't know if I've seen many films where the psychic or the priest or whatever comes in and leaves under a minute because they're so intimidated by the environment and by the feel of the demon or the presence that is there with them. That kind of just heightened the sense of dread for this couple. A little side note, something with Katie. The two moments where she stands over Mika and watches him for hours while he's sleeping. It is more intense for me, even more so today, because my wife also sleepwalks, talks sometimes, and my mother-in-law used to tell me how she would wake up in the middle of the night, and my wife would just be standing over her, just staring. I've been with her almost 7 years now, and she hasn't quite done that yet, but I really, really hope she doesn't, because I don't know what my reaction would be. I kept thinking about that, though, when I saw Katie staying over Mika on this viewing. One of the last things I wanted to discuss was the endings. There's supposedly 3 endings to this film, although I'm not sure if one of them ever got filmed. But I've seen 2 of them. I do prefer the original ending, with Mika being thrown out the camera, and Katie crawling over to him, and then to the camera before it cuts. That's just the best ending, as far as the ones that I've seen or read about. But when I first saw this with my stepbrother on DVD, for some reason we watched the alternate ending first, which involved Katie coming up the stairs without Mika, walking up to the camera and cutting her own throat. And while that is creepy, I do think the original ending is much more unsettling. And of course it continues the story. But apparently the other is with Katie coming up the stairs with a knife and sitting on the bed, just staring off into space for a couple days. And then a friend comes over and discovers Mika's body and calls the police. They search the home until they enter the room with Katie. She snaps out of it and starts panicking, wondering where Mika is. Unfortunately, she never drops the knife, so they have to shoot her dead right there in her room in front of the camera. So that's an interesting ending, though not quite as iconic as the one they end up going with for the series. My love for found footage definitely started here. My main complaint is how this one doesn't quite hold up as well as some of the other ones, but I still rate it very high because I was still unsettled watching this, even though it's been maybe my 4th or 5th time watching it. I think it's still very creepy. It's paced super well, and for the budget it had, and just the effort Oren Peli put into it, I think it still just a really fun watch. And it is a classic by this point, a modern day classic, at least in my opinion. People might disagree with me on that, but I think they utilized every bit of their budget and their resources beautifully. So I'll still give Paranormal Activity 1 a 7 out of 10. So, that leaves just one film left at my number 1 spot. After rewatching, I was surprised I ended up putting this one here, but I was shocked how much more I liked this film this time around. So my number 1 Paranormal Activity film is Paranormal Activity 3, were Katie and Christy as children and their origin story of their lifelong haunting. The story starts September 3rd, 1988, Katie's birthday. Pretty soon into this film, we hear the name Toby for the first time, which is the likely made-up name for the demon involved with all this mayhem. Henry Joost and Rael Schulman are directors also for this film, as well as, again, the fourth film. Not the original trilogy in this franchise, this was the highest grossing film. One thing about this film and the second film, they received some backlash for their trailers having a lot of scenes that were not in the final theatrical release. And I understand the frustration. I do have a memory of how much was left out in the third film when I finally saw it, compared to what was in the trailer. So now, honestly, I just try and avoid trailers as much as I can. At least long ones, or the 2.5-minute ones, that kind of reveal just about everything about the story. Of course, if I'm at the theater, that has to be a different story. I just get over it, but otherwise, I try not to watch trailers if I don't have to. They had some excuse I read on a little bit, but I call bullshit still. So fuck 2.5-minute trailers anyway, but definitely don't add a bunch of scenes in there that are not going to be in the film. That's just cheap and lazy to me. But moving on, aside from that, this time around I just felt more uneasy nearly the entire time, even when nothing in particular was happening. I don't know for sure why, but everything just felt extra ominous the entire time, and everything was just directed and filmed just so much better than some of the other films to me. We also see more of the manipulation and conversations the girls are having with this unseen force, and knowing what's coming for them ultimately, it's just all the more tragic watching all of it unfold. This is the first time we see the interactions with the kids, as Paranormal Activity 2 obviously had a toddler, warning their parents it's dangerous to talk about Toby and his intentions. It still usually gets to me a bit when a character is told that the being or the threat is standing right behind them, especially when they can't see them, just like the mom being told by Christy that Toby was right behind her. That's just a little ominous moment that I enjoyed. The unique twist they put on one of the cameras was utilizing an oscillating fan base and capture the living room as well as the connecting kitchen. I was always eager to watch these scenes and these shots. The slow rotations, not knowing what will pop up, which is really exhilarating to me. A standout scene also, for maybe my first viewing years ago, was with Randy and Katie playing Bloody Mary in the bathroom. This easily could have been like a really lame scene that they could have just thrown in there, because it has been done before. But honestly, I think they did a great job with it. The consequences that they have to face, and you can hear it in Randy's voice, him trying to be calm for Katie, while trying to, at the same time, reason out what's going on in his head, and trying to control his own panic. And it carried on for a minute too, unsure of whether Toby was going to let go or not, before harming one of them. This film even pulled off a figure standing under a white sheet, like someone pretending to be a ghost. After all these years, I still enjoyed that shot and that transition, again with the oscillating fan and the babysitter. It still blows me away that was so well done, in my opinion. The night segments are more consistent than the first two to me, ramping up the suspense much quicker. And the thing was, I was fully ready to only love the ending of this film, because I think that's kind of how I felt the first time around when I was younger. This is definitely my first or second favorite ending in the series. One of my favorite moments being Dennis searching for his wife and the girls at Grandma Lois's house, only to open a door down a hall and turn on a light to reveal just 3 random Coven members just staring at him casually, letting him to run away. That image of the 3 witches just still is burned into my memory all these years later. This was also the first appearance, I believe, of the other Coven members, so that made it all the more unsettling. Then them slowly following him as he runs away. The brutal backpin also that finished off Dennis was something that I surprisingly did not remember from my last viewing. I kept thinking he was dead like 2 different times, so I was surprised to see the scene keep playing out like it did. It's also kind of hard to fathom the brainwashing of Katie and Christy, to where they had no real reaction at all to their dad dying violently right in front of them. This installment just hit so many different marks for me, and of course this is just personal preference, but this is just the strongest film in the series in my opinion. So I'm going to go with a 7.7 out of 10 for this film. but still a little slow in places, and I wish we could have seen a little more explanation, even still with Katie and Christy, got into their heads and their thought processes a little bit more as they transitioned. But to be fair, that is hard, especially with it being found footage. And they still fit a lot in a relatively short runtime. Alright guys, so that is my ranking for the Paranormal Activity franchise. I actually surprisingly had a blast watching these again and working through my rankings in my head, as like I said, several were pretty difficult. Definitely want to do more ranking videos. I'll have to think about which one I want to do next. Let me know if you guys have any opinions on what I should do. Paranormal Activity was such a fun series as a whole, especially as a found footage fan. I expected to go back into there feeling much less towards them, much less excitement, but I'm surprised that was definitely not the case. As overused as this method is today, there's still a lot to praise for me. I was fully invested in the history and the story, and how everything unfolded and connected. Pay more attention to the coven and the different symbols, and the different little clues you get throughout. It was just such a fun time, so thank you so much again guys for listening. I really hope all of you had fun with this one, and I hope you are excited to see more. So I'll see you next time on The Entertainment Room.